I wish I could be with you guys at Ocean Reef. I have great memories of that place, and you're fortunate to be there. If you got to go through a COVID virus, I guess the best place to do it is at Ocean Reef. I'm sorry I can't be there. I wish I could, and I hope there'll be another time. But I appreciate very much this opportunity to preach and teach. I wish there was a way we could have a question and answer period. Frankly, some days I think this COVID is a crock, and other days I think we're all going to die. The really hard thing, and you should have sympathy for me, is trying to smoke my pipe wearing this stupid mic. At any rate, we're in Advent. We're going to talk a little bit about Christmas. I haven't always done well with Christmas. In fact, I have developed somewhat of a reputation of being a Scrooge at Christmas. I'm better now, and I think mostly that was because it's hard to be a pastor at Christmas time. You see people and you see what they go through, those who have lost loved ones. They listen for footfalls and they're not there anymore. They don't have somebody to wind the clocks anymore, to sit down with breakfast coffee and to talk. And that's a loss if it happened over the year. And at Christmas, it's a major loss. When I was a pastor, my counseling load doubled and sometimes tripled. And then there were the services. Every time you turned around, another Christmas service, another Christmas tree. And so Christmas was not my best time of the year. But I haven't been a pastor for a long time, and I'm not only looking like Santa Claus, I'm feeling a little bit like him too. I like Christmas better, but not for the reasons you think. I have a friend, my best friend, by the way, who was killed in an automobile accident 7 or 8 years ago. His name was Rusty Anderson, and I loved him a lot, and I miss him still to this day. Rusty loved Jesus with all of his heart, cussed like a sailor, and drank like a fish. But when he talked about Jesus, you listened, because when he talked, you knew that he had been there and he had done that. One time he called me during the Christmas season, and he knew I was having a hard trouble with it. And he said, "Steve, I've got a great idea." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Let's take Jesus out of Christmas." I said, "You can't do that. We're trying to put him back into it." And Rusty said, "Oh, no, we could have our own Christmas with Jesus in the summer. He was probably born there anyway. And then without Jesus in Christmas, we wouldn't have to feel guilty about the parties and the shopping and the presents." I like all of that, but the problem is Jesus messes it up. So let's take Jesus out of Christmas. That might work, but probably not. Right now, during this season, I've heard more than once people say, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't feel it much this year." Well, first, that's because you don't remember last year when you said exactly the same thing. And secondly, we have had this divisive election. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And then we get a pandemic on top of all of it. It'll play havoc with the Christmas spirit. But as I said, you probably said the same thing last year. Somebody told me not too long ago that they're going to cancel Christmas because nothing can live up to its hype. That may be true. But I don't want you to miss what Christmas is all about. I have this nightmare each year about a husband and wife taking down the Christmas decorations. And they're not believers. Well, they go to church a couple of times a year at Christmas and Easter. They're putting away the decorations. And she says to him, there was something there, but I don't know what it was. And I think we missed it. You don't want to miss it this year. And so I'm here to help. Let me start with a text from the Gospel of John, the first chapter. It's a Christmas text, but it's not the traditional Christmas story. The problem with the traditional story in Matthew and in Luke is that it's read so many times and preached on so many times that we don't listen anymore. And frankly, it's hard at Christmas for a pastor to think of how to say it again without being boring or pedantic or shallow, because Christmas really is a big deal. And when you get it, it makes all the difference in the world. So I'm going to read to you from the first verses of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, where John the Apostle, a close friend of mine, by the way, writes as follows. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Oh my. That's enough for a sermon. But let me make a couple of comments. We're going to talk about the actual text a little bit more. But first, I don't want you to miss something that's in that text. Note the juxtaposition between the law and the grace. Note what John says. He says the law came through Moses. That's a good thing. The law, the psalmist says, is perfect. The law was a gift from God. Ask any Orthodox rabbi, what's the best thing God ever did for his people? And he will say, Torah, the law. The law's a good thing. But John says the law came through Moses. But, however, you're not going to believe this. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John the Apostle, when he wrote that, knew exactly what he was doing because he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Law comes first. Why? So we can be good? Give it up. You're not good enough to be good. The law came through Moses to make you feel guilty and to wear a hair shirt and to beat yourself over your back with a cat of nine tails. Oh no. The law was given for one reason, so you would know who you are. The scripture says the heart is deceitful above all things, desperately corrupt. Who can understand it? And the law is a mirror to let you know that. It's hard, isn't it? We thought we were good. It's hard, isn't it? Because we thought they were bad. It's hard, isn't it? Because we don't like to think of ourselves as sinners. But if you don't get it. Jesus said he came for the sick, not the well people. I'm sick. I've been doing this for a long time, and frankly, I thought by now, I'm as old as dirt, that I would be better. And sometimes I think I'm not better at all. And those are the times when I experience his grace. The law came through Moses. I know who I am. And grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I have a friend. His name is Michael Kelly Blanchard. He's probably one of the best lyricists in America. He lives in Connecticut. He's written a number of things for Peter, Paul, and Mary. But he's a Christian, and he loves to write songs about mercy. There's a wonderful song that he wrote about a girl whose parents were in an automobile accident and whose mother was killed. And he told me the story, and it's a true one. The father, probably because he was driving the car and felt guilty, became a real problem to his daughter. They would have fights. One time the police were called, and finally he kicked her out of his house. She went to live with her grandmother. And so you know, she was a party girl. She had an abortion. She was on to drugs and booze. She worked at a factory, by the way, and there was a man there with a big black Bible, and he used to tell her she was going to hell. And she said she knew that. He would say, God's going to judge you, and she knew she deserved it. But the chorus in that song is so beautiful. Michael tells about the room where she lived at her grandmother's house and about a picture of Jesus, maybe a Holman head of Christ, I don't know. And the chorus goes like this, and there's a picture of Jesus hanging on the wall, and it's been there since I was very small. And he looks like he just seen a little girl fall, and he don't look angry at all. He don't look angry at all. That's what it's about, folks. The law lets us know, and it's important that we know. Grace and truth says, because of my son, I'm not angry at all. Well, I guess I ought to go to the main body of the sermon. I sometimes teach seminary students how to preach. And I often tell them the problem with a sermon isn't a 3-point sermon, but a 3-sermon sermon. In other words, you think you have to tell them everything in every sermon, and you forget if you're a pastor, you get another shot next week. Well, I'm going to do something that's almost unheard of in the annals of the homiletical discipline. I'm going to have 2 points, and that's it. And then we're finished. But listen up. They're important 2 points that can make a major difference in your life, especially at Christmas. The first point is this. It really happened. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have a talk show, and it's on a couple of hundred stations around the country, and you can go to keylife.org and check it out. It also has a video version, and we have several thousand people who've subscribed to that. And I'm recording this, and just a week or 2 ago on our talk show, we had as our guest a guy by the name of Louis Markos, Dr. Louis Markos. And he wrote a book, I'm not sure I've got the title right, but Myth Became Fact, looking at Roman and Greek mythology through Christian eyes. And the thing he says is that throughout history and mythology in general, and certainly in Greek and Roman mythology, you have a myth informing us of what was going to happen because it's built into the very nature of the universe. In fact, he said something I didn't know, and I didn't know there was anything I didn't know about C.S. Lewis. He's my hero. He said that C.S. Lewis came to Christ not directly, but through Greek and Roman myths. And then he explained that J.R.R. Tolkien was the one who did it. Lewis was an atheist, as you possibly know, into his 30s, professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Oxford and later at Cambridge. And he thought of the Christian faith because it so resembled other myths. The Christian faith was a myth. And Tolkien said to him, maybe you ought to look at it a different way. And then he said, maybe all of those myths turn to a reality, a fact of Jesus. And that started Lewis thinking differently. And 2 weeks later, when he was making his way to Whipsnade Zoo, he became a Christian through mythology. There's so much more, and I wish I had the time to go into it. Let me give you a mini lesson in history. Some 1,500, 2,000 years before the coming of Christ, a group of nobodies in the middle of the desert came up with the idea that there was one God, and he had called them to be his people. That's almost unbelievable. They developed the highest form of ethical monotheism the world had ever seen. And they lived among cultures that were sophisticated and big and rich. And these people in the desert, living in tents with their cattle, came up with something that was almost unbelievable. In fact, one of the great arguments for the existence of God is the existence of the Jews. I don't know if you have any Babylonian neighbors, but you probably don't. But you probably have Jewish neighbors. Their very existence is an argument for the existence of God. Don't have time to go into that, but they began, if you can picture it, down a corridor of time. And some 500 years, give or take 100, I'm not a historian, there was another corridor of human history that began, and it was the Greco-Roman corridor of human history. And there was great philosophy, great architecture. When the Romans came along, there was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And there was peace throughout the entire Western world. Not only that, there was a common language. Not only that, there was a common coinage. And there was Alexander, when you're talking about the Greeks, the Peloponnesian Wars, you know all of that. Those two themes of human history moved in parallel corridors down time. And at one time, they crossed. And at the moment they crossed, Jesus of Nazareth was born. If he had been born 40 years before, you would have never heard his name. If he had been born 40 years later, you would never have heard his name. And if you think that's an accident, you'll believe anything. And there's more. There's the cultural stuff, the cultural forms that were made. We've seen in the text, and the Word, the Logos, became flesh. Did you know that both the Greeks and the Jews had a concept of that? The Greeks understood molecular biology before any of us knew molecules existed. They said, the Greek philosophers, that something held things together. For instance, they said this stool on which I'm sitting would come apart if it weren't for one thing, and what was that? The Logos. And the Jews traced wisdom literature, personifying it in the Word of God that was spoken, and they understood Logos. So when John wrote the text I read to you, the Greeks, that would be us, and the Jews, that would be them, the Goyim and the Hebrews said, we get it. God prepared that. This really happened. Don Richardson, who was a missionary, he's now in heaven, wrote a book a long time ago. It was called Eternity in Their Hearts. And that book blew me away. He said, if you examine cultures, you will find if no missionary has been there, they knew him, they just didn't know his name. Throughout every culture on the face of the earth, the mythology reflects the reality of God's major act in history when the Word became flesh. Did you know, and then I can't spend too much time, more time on this, but did you know that in every culture that we know about, primitive or otherwise, third world or sophisticated, there is the idea of sacrifice? That without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin. Where did they all get that? Let me tell you something. It's in their DNA. It's a part of history. It's a part of everything. At Christmas, enjoy the parties and the gifts and the decorations, but you won't get it unless you stop for a minute and say, son of a gun, this isn't a story. This really happened. And then one other point, it won't be so long. Not only did it really happen, it changed everything. It really did. Because he came, if you feel guilty, you don't have to anymore. You're forgiven. If you worry about death, and I'm old and cramming for finals, you don't have to, because he said, those who believe in me will never die. If there's no meaning in your life, stop it. He is the meaning of everything. He is the center of why we were created, loved and forgiven. Great mercy. That's why we celebrate Christmas. That's why Christians ought to be the people who celebrate it the most, because we're the only ones who have anything about which to celebrate. Let me tell you a story, and then I'm finished. Young couple, they were wonderful. They met when he was 17 and she was 15. They dated in high school, and pretty soon after high school, they got married. And then one after another, 3 children were born to that marriage. And for all that looked from the outside, it looked like a happy marriage. But one day, she was standing before the sink piled with dirty dishes. There were dirty diapers over in the corner and so much to be done, and the children were causing havoc. Children do that, you know. And she took off her apron, threw it on the floor, walked out the back door, and left. She was a good mother and she cared. He came home about 20 minutes later and she timed it well. And he looked for his wife and he couldn't find her. He called everybody he knew and he couldn't find her. He played with the kids and fed them and put them to bed, and she called that night. And he said, well, I can't tell you what he said, but you know, where were you? And she said, how are the children? And he said, well, they're fed, if that's what you mean, and they're asleep at that, but where are you? And she hung up on him. Conversation kind of like that took place over and over again, till finally he was broken. When she would call now, he would say, oh, I love you so much, and we miss you so much. Please come home. And she would hang up. Finally, he hired a private detective to find his lost wife. She left a trail. Wasn't so hard. When he issued his report, he told the husband that she was living in a third-rate hotel in Ames, Iowa. He borrowed enough money from his in-laws, got a plane ticket, and flew to Iowa. He found the hotel, and he had prepared a speech. And he walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor in the room where the clerk said his wife was, and knocked on the door. She opened the door, and he forgot his speech, and he just said, I love you. Won't you come home? And she fell apart in his arms. They made it back to their home, and he didn't talk about it much for a long time. But one night when the children were asleep, he dared to approach her with a question that had haunted him. And he said to her, what happened? I told you I loved you, and you know that I do. I begged you to come back. I would have done anything to bring you back. Why wouldn't you listen? And then she said something powerful. She said, those were only words. And then you came. That's what Christmas is about. For centuries, people had looked in the skies and asked, is there a God? And if there is, what is he like? Is he a monster? Does he desire the fruit of the womb for the sin of my soul? Does he care? Does he love? And then very hesitantly, does he love me? And then he came. You think about that. And Merry Christmas.